my landlords, the Boones. My name is Maria, and where I come from, stories about monsters, ghosts, and demons were as common as you can imagine. And this particular story happened when I was 13 years old. I used to live in a poor village from the South Pacific. Despite my family being poor, my parents managed to save up some money so I could board in a slightly bigger village called Del Monte, so I could study in a high school there and get better education. Del Monte is a village surrounded by nature, known for its pineapple plantations. It's an enchanting village that has beaches and forests. And to get there, one would have to travel through a thick, misty mountain range. Despite being a poor village, it had high schools, banks, and hospitals, a far cry from my village, because unfortunately mine had none of these luxuries. Summer was just about to end, and I could clearly remember how nervous I was to travel to the village of Del Monte, despite this being my second time going there. But this would be my first time going there alone. The first time I traveled there was with my parents a week prior to enroll in my high school, and since my mother's friend, Mrs. Rosario, knew of a place I could board in with low rental fee, especially for student boarders, luck was by my side. I had a place to stay. I traveled to Del Monte via jeepney, a type of public utility vehicle that serves as the most popular means of public transportation in my country. The trip was grueling and exhausting. The jeepney had to zigzag along the edge of a mountain range, and the roads were bumpy as ever. Luckily, the cool mountain mist kept me cool that day, but it took about 3 hours to get there. It was about 4 in the afternoon when I arrived at Del Monte. My mother's friend, Mrs. Rosario, met me at the jeepney terminal and gave me the bad news that the boarding space she was talking about a week prior was already full and was no longer accepting additional boarders. Thankfully, she offered me to stay at her place for the time being, until I could find a new place to board. I stayed about a week at her place and managed to befriend her daughter Lucy, who was the same age as I was. From my week at her house, I was intrigued about this whole village. From my experience, I could say that during the daytime, the village was filled with life and joy. At the house, I could hear that I was surrounded by all sorts of noise, from the crowing roosters to children's laughter and the sounds of motorcycles that go along the main road, and everyone seemed to know one another. Everything seemed beautiful, laid back, and peaceful. But during the evenings, darkness seemed to swallow everything. Since the village had no streetlights, only the stars and the moon would illuminate the dark surroundings. And by then, everyone is already in their homes. At night, animalistic sounds seem to be heard all around. Some you can decipher as croaking frogs and the clicking sounds of the cicadas. But at times I could swear I could hear something strange, carnivorous in nature, but unrecognizable. When my school finally started, I sat beside a kind and meek girl named Rebecca, and we quickly became friends. She mentioned that she also came from another village, so we had a special bond because of that fact. During our time as seatmates, I mentioned to her that I am in need of a place to board. Hearing this, she was ecstatic, as she too was a boarder, and her landlords were looking for another bed spacer. So it became a done deal. I was going to meet her landlords and inform them that I am interested to board. After school, I went to her place. It was about a 30-minute walk. We passed by a pineapple plantation to get there. The house where Rebecca was boarding was almost at the outskirts of the village, nearing the mountains, and was surrounded by trees. The small house was made of wood, and most of the windows were covered with all sorts of paper, and the overgrown vegetation in the garden was littered with rubbish, from old truck wheels to broken glass sprinkled around here and there. These objects in the garden somehow created shadows against the sun that seemed to move of their own accord. The place was a little eerie, but I ignored those facts as I was in desperate need of a place to board. After entering the house, Rebecca introduced me to the owner of the property, Mr. Boone. Mr. Boone seemed to be in his late 40s or early 50s. He was a short, thin man. Despite having thick, black hair, the attributes of youth, the wrinkles creased on his forehead and the corners of his eyes revealed his true age. When he smiled, he gave me an impression that he was nice and trustworthy. He mentioned that since his 20-year-old daughter was already working and had moved to another village, he now has an extra room for 2 girls to board in. In passing, he also mentioned that he had a wife, but she wouldn't be back for a couple of days. Looking at the room, Rebecca showed me the corner where she sleeps and another corner where I could sleep in if I decide to board with her. She also showed me that we had our own bathroom attached to the room. Despite the house looking a little creepy, I thought about the perks. The place was in my budget. I would have a friend who would live with me, and we had our own bathroom. So I agreed to Mr. Boone's terms. Since I brought my stack of cash with me that my parents gave to pay for a boarding space, I paid Mr. Boone for a whole month's rent in advance. The only rule that he mentioned was that we just stay in our room during the rest of the evenings, which was pretty reasonable in my opinion. I went back to my mom's friend's house to get my stuff, and when I got there, I told Mrs. Rosario about my new place, expecting her to be happy for me. But she was more shocked than anything else. "Child, I know of the Boone family. Are you sure you want to live there?" Mrs. Rosario asked, with concern in her voice. "I don't think I have any other option. Yes, the place seems a little far, but I have a friend living with me, and I am sure I can manage," I told her, rest assuring that everything would be okay. "Okay then, but please be careful, and know that you can count on me if you need help with anything," Mrs. Rosario said before bidding me farewell. My first week at the Boones was pleasant. My shared room with Rebecca was relatively cool, and we didn't need to use any electric fan. In fact, we had thick blankets to keep us warm during the evenings. There were even times that the cold, thick mist would drop down from the mountains and would sometimes enter the bedroom from the cracks of our window and from the crack underneath our door threshold from the living room. Everything seemed perfect. Unfortunately, in school, when our classmates learned that we boarded at the Boones, rumors had spread like wildfire. One day, during recess, Mrs. Rosario's daughter Lucy told Rebecca and I that the Boones were 𝐍𝐢𝐿𝐼𝐻. 𝐍𝐻𝐿𝐼𝐻 are dreaded supernatural creatures in Philippine mythology that represent darkness and caution. She mentioned that the Boones never participated in any of the community events, and that Mrs. Boone was a weird woman. She never talks to anyone, but somehow she would always befriend pregnant women, showering them with gifts and food that she prepared, Lucy said. She added that pregnant ladies have been warned in secret not to accept these gifts, as the women before them who did would get really sick or go mad, which they would never recover from. Hearing this, Rebecca and I were shocked, but we did tell her that so far nothing weird has happened in our place, though we have not seen Mrs. Boone yet. It was a strange coincidence, but when Rebecca and I went back to our place, Mr. Boone introduced us to his wife, Mrs. Boone. I was expecting her to look like an old witch, with warts and wrinkles covering her face, but surprisingly, she looked beautiful, with long black hair. Being in a beach village, you would think she would get a tan, but she was actually very pale, and the light of the sun revealed her flawless alabaster complexion. She looked very young. If one saw her and guessed her age, they might mistake her for a woman in her mid-20s, but that couldn't be, as her daughter was in her 20s already. Rebecca and I were smiling while we were being introduced by Mr. Boone to her. I was expecting her to give us a warm welcome in return. However, when she greeted us and introduced herself, she seemed distant and quite cold, as if she didn't care of our existence, almost angry actually. Very different from the warm and gentle demeanor of her husband. We stayed in our room all night. For some reason, the Boones were in the living room arguing loudly. We could even hear some things being thrown on the ground, sounding like dishes breaking. Despite not hearing ourselves in their argument, I felt that we were one of the reasons of their disagreement, and because of that we didn't sleep very well. To make things worse, at the dead of night, After their argument, we could hear strange, eerie animalistic sounds outside our window. It sounded like a creature eating something raw, as we could hear crushing sounds like loud chewing and bones breaking. The next day, Mr. Boone told us that he would be leaving for a couple of days, and that Mrs. Boone would be the only one in the house. He then repeated his rule again to us, that no matter what we do, we shouldn't go out of our rooms at night. It was a little strange that he mentioned this again, but I didn't mind it. Before I left to school that day, I made a quick glance inside the house. I was expecting trash and broken glass on the floor, but thankfully, nothing seemed in disarray. However, as I went to the side of the house where our window was, it seemed that on the ground there was a dead chicken, and its insides were missing. It looked like a massacre, and the scene was absolutely horrific. It felt like our worst nightmares were suddenly being realized. We would be alone with a lady that wasn't really happy that we were there. So I thought to myself to expect the unexpected. During school, I told Rebecca that we should prepare provisions for the night. She agreed, and before we went back home, we bought some food, from cup noodles, bottles of fresh water, and potato chips that can last us through the night. As we arrived home, the house was empty. We looked around for Mrs. Boone and even called out for her, but she wasn't there. So all we did was stay in our room and made sure we locked our door and kept our window shut. Rebecca and I did our assignments. We got to eat, and by the time it was 9 in the evening, we started making small talk about our lives to pass the time so that we could fall asleep. After a few minutes in our conversation, we heard something enter the house. "Mrs. Boone?" I said, waiting for her to respond. But nobody responded. Then something strange happened. We started hearing loud scratches on the other side of the wall from the living room. It sounded like sharp fingernails clawing its way inside our room. Rebecca and I went to the furthest corner of the room, away from the wall. We were trembling as we huddled against each other. I could feel my heart racing and a feeling of uneasiness around me. Then we heard our doorknob being tampered with, and when Rebecca saw the doorknob moving, she gave an uncontrolled shriek before covering her mouth to quiet herself. The thing outside must have heard her as the doorknob stopped moving. Then a woman's voice was heard. "Girls, are you okay? I heard a shriek. Why don't you let me enter so I can protect you?" The voice from the other side said, awfully concerned. I knew it was Mrs. Boone, but she sounded overly sweet, so different from how she greeted us when we first met. It was eerie as can be. Rebecca and I were both terrified, and we didn't answer her, so the clawing on the walls and tampering of our doorknob continued. But after a few minutes, it stopped, which made everything fall into silence. Rebecca and I held each other's hands to express our relief, and I could feel her hands trembling and were ice cold. I wrapped her body with her blanket, before I wrapped myself in my blanket as well. Though everything was dead silent, I was wide awake, staring at our door, alert as ever. Eventually, at around 2 in the morning, I heard Rebecca starting to snore. I wanted to stay up, but I felt my eyes closing. I guess I must have dozed off eventually. I then awoke to feeling pressure on my body and chest. I knew I was lying down and my whole body was covered by my blanket. However, I felt like something was lying on top of me. As I opened my eyes, staring in front of me was Rebecca, stiff as a board, as if she had seen a ghost. She had everything covered by her blanket but her face. She popped out her finger from inside her blanket and was pointing at something on top of me. In the corner of my eyes, I could see a figure of a woman. It was Mrs. Boone, lying on top of me, using me as her bed. She just laid there, smirking. Eventually, she started laughing profusely. Tears ran through my eyes, thinking that this could be my last night on Earth. But then, after a while, Mrs. Boone just stood up and then dashed outside our room, slamming our bedroom door on her way out. Rebecca and I didn't sleep after that horrific ordeal. During the morning, at the very first sight of daylight, even during our exhausted state, we started to pack our things. despite clearly knowing that we didn't have any place to go to. We left early to school that day. We told our classmates about what we experienced. Most of them were skeptical about everything, but thankfully, a handful of them, including Lucy, were eager to help. Our classmates, the ones who felt sorry for us, chipped in some money and gave a few snacks for us for the night. After class, Rebecca managed to find a new place for us to board, but unfortunately, the place was currently unavailable in such short notice. The landlords were asking that we gave them a day so that they could prepare our room. We had no other choice, so we agreed. Lucy also went with me to buy salt, garlic, and a huge bottle of holy water with a squirt cap, which she said were items we needed to ward off the 𝐒𝐿𝐠𝐿. Despite knowing that we would have to sleep one more night at the Boones, I was confident, because I knew we were prepared. It was late in the afternoon when we finished everything. We were racing the sunset. Even if we were tired from lack of sleep, we made a mad dash to the house before daylight vanished. As Rebecca and I approached the Boones' house, I thought I saw Mrs. Boone eating something in the garden. As she glanced at me, I could have sworn I saw her tongue sticking out in such a weird way. But when I rubbed my eyes to have a second look, Mrs. Boone disappeared from our sight. When we arrived in the house, Rebecca and I sprinted to our room, and we quickly locked the door behind us. I opened the container where I placed the salt and garlic that I purchased. I sprinkled the salt around the entrance of our door and window, and even cut the garlic into cloves and placed them in certain corners of our room. The smell was pungent, but I rather smell that, knowing that it would give us a sense of security, even if we didn't know if all of this was going to work or not. We stayed in our room all night, expecting something crazy to happen, but thankfully nothing ever did. I was secretly counting the time till daylight, so we can collect our stuff and finally leave this creepy house. As the time passed, we were getting pretty exhausted, and I could feel myself fighting to stay awake. I think it was midnight when we fell asleep, but then, about 2 a.m, we woke up to a loud sound crashing on top of our room's roof. My heart was pounding in my chest, and as I looked around the room, Rebecca was looking up on the ceiling where the crash was heard. After a few seconds of when we heard the crash, we then heard clawing sounds, like something was trying to dig its way into our room through the roof. We were both stunned at what we were hearing, as the sound reverberated loudly through our room. To be honest, I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was the holy water I remembered I had, or the lack of sleep I was enduring. Because out of nowhere, I mustered all my courage and went out of our room to go outside the house. As I looked up, there I saw it. A silhouette of a woman standing on the roof of the house. I screamed out of fright, but with the holy water I had, I began to pray out loud as I squirted the liquid out, making sure to have aimed at the roof. I must have hit the creature, as it screamed profusely. As the creature continued to wail and scream, I noticed that the woman's body began to contort and twist into unnatural ways. Piercing cries filled the air as bones cracked and muscles stretched, reshaping her form to something otherworldly. Feathers began to sprout out from her back, soaked in a dark liquid matter. It seemed to glisten in the pale moonlight. Her wings grew almost instantly. Then the air began to smell coppery, almost iron-like. At that point, it hit me. I was smelling blood. With a final agonizing scream, her transformation seemed to be complete. The once human body of Mrs. Boone was now monster-like. She then darted to the air, causing a gust of wind to blow around. The horrible creature then began flying circles around the house at first, until finally it flew to the dark abyss of the forest. Feeling that it was gone, I then ran back inside the house and made sure that I locked both the house door and our bedroom door that morning. I thought I stayed up through the whole ordeal, but somehow, I guess, I must have fallen asleep because when I woke up, it was bright, and the sun's ray was gently beaming inside our room. With our bags already packed the previous day, we exited our room, ready to leave the house. But as we were leaving, we saw Mr. Boone, with a sad expression written all over his face, sitting on a chair next to the dining table. I was going to tell him about what we witnessed during the time he was out, but it seemed that he didn't want to hear any of it. He simply gave me a pouch. Inside was a stack of cash. I assumed the reimbursement of the money that Rebecca and I paid him for our stay. Everything finally went back to normal after we settled into our new boarding space. From my 4 years of high school, no one has ever seemed to have rented from the Boones. Rumors of their strange behavior was wildly talked about, and everyone seemed to avoid the couple. I never did see them again, though I heard from the grapevine that Mr. Boone had rapidly aged, while Mrs. Boone remained beautiful and flawless as ever, as if the passing of time never aged her. Not even a single day.
What do you think about the story? Do you want more creepy, chilling horror stories? If so, please like this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel, The Night Owl's Midnight Stories, so I can grow my brand and in return provide you with more horror stories. Thank you, fellow night owls, and may you have a good